Hi, NASC. My name is Spring Richards. I'm your NASC president. I'm super excited to announce this new social media campaign we're starting called Let's Talk Tuesdays, where every other Tuesday we'll post on our Instagram and YouTube's videos of conversations between student leaders and community members about current events and societal topics that are going on to start valuable conversations in your own councils. And I have NASC board members with me today, as well as NASC alum Mr. Alex Dixon. And I'm super excited to see where the conversation goes, so take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Bryanna Salazar. I attend Liberty High School and I am NASC 4A1 Vice President.
Hello, my name's Aiden Western. I go to Liberty High School as well. I'm currently the NASC Communications Coordinator.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex Dixon. I'm a former NASC alum. I attended Durango High School. I graduated in 1999 where I was a student body president and proud member of NASC. And so I'm so glad to be here and joining you all for this conversation.
Thank you for being here. So today we are talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I have a blurb from their website, so I'm going to just read and give everyone a little bit of summary about what the movement's goal is and what Hashtag Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter Foundation is a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by state and vigilantes. By combating and counteracting acts of violence, creating a space for Black imagination and innovation, centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvements in our lives. The movement focuses on issues concerning racial injustice, police brutality, criminal justice reform, Black immigration, economic injustice, LGBTQIA+ and human rights, environmental injustice, access to healthcare, access to quality education, and voting rights and suppression. All right, so our first question is, what does the current Black Lives Matter movement mean for us as student leaders?
Well, that's great. Now, and again, thank you for having such courageous conversations and for hopping on and engaging. And so I think, so first and foremost, Black Lives Matter. Like, I mean, in stating it and just putting it out there, I think as leaders, as I reflect back upon not only my time as a student leader, as well as that as now a community leader, is that I firmly believe that it is our duty, whether we are in student government like you all, or whether you're a teacher, a counselor, or leader in the community, it's our job and responsibility to make sure that we unlock the human potential of everyone in which we come into contact with. And so I liken so many things in my life to my time as student body president at Durango High School. And if I think of the cafeteria, in which cafeteria, just like many of you all entering every day, is you think about that high school and you think about all the different tables where people sit inside a cafeteria, right? And there's different cliques and different groups and there's different organizations. And so I joke and say you've got the jocks, the geeks, the freaks, the cheerleaders, the nerds, the religious groups, all these different kind of components. And so what's important is that we unlock the human potential of people no matter where they sit, let's say in the lunchroom. And so if you think of talent, or if you think of talent, it is equally distributed among all those different tables, among all those different people. But opportunity isn't always necessarily equally distributed among all those different groups. And I think at the heart of Black Lives Matter is it's a reckoning with our history as a country. I love the United States. I'm born and raised here. My family's been here for multiple generations. But it would be anathema if we did not say that my family came over here in chains. We were slaved when we came to the country. In spite of the 400 plus years of slavery, segregation, all these different things within our country, I still believe that we live in the greatest country in the world. And we're the greatest country in the world, and we do the best things that we can be when we do what I just described, and that is unlocking the potential of everyone in which we come around with. And so I think at the core of the Black Lives Matter is that our country has made progressive steps over the years, let's say, to get better, right? We were slaves at one point. White people, let's say, were better than Black people. I fundamentally believe that most people in their hearts don't believe that. But at one point in our country's past and in our country's history, we, in fact, codified within the Constitution of the United States that it was okay to own Black people, right? And so in that case, when we talk about institutional, let's say, racism, it institutionalized a belief that one people were better than others. And so I think it's important to be able to say, even as in 2020, where we sit today, at one point in our nation's history, it was a belief that some people mattered more than others. And there are policies that we are still impacted today, that we are impacted by when people believed that white people were better than black people. And so I think what we're seeing today is a manifestation of, although in many cases, many of the statutorial things that kept people oppressed have either been released, relaxed, or no longer introduced, we still have the remnants of a time in our country where it was common belief that white people are better than black people. What I think this movement has done is really kind of shine a light on the injustices within our criminal justice system that puts in place meaningful impacts to people of color. But as we think about the impact of white supremacy, it is really along an entire spectrum that impacts socioeconomic outcomes, health outcomes, and the day-to-day lives of people who may look, different than one another. We have done things to unlock the potential of people. And in order to become a more perfect union, we constantly have to challenge ourselves to say is, in order for us to be at our best, all of American citizens have to be at their best. And what this movement is at its core is a group of people saying, I love this country. I love and I'm a part of it. And I'm going to, be a part of civic disobedience as it is at the core of our nation's founding. But in this time, we're specifically looking at a group of people who need to have that unlocked potential. And that's what is my sense of the state of affairs and how I believe of the movement and where we are as a country.
I agree with you a lot. I think that for us as student leaders, it's really important to kind of elevate our peers. We obviously, I am not the same as everyone that have been elected to represent as a student leader. I've never been a victim of systemic oppression. I've never been anything of the sort. And I think that as student leaders, it's important for us to recognize that and talk to members of our community, as well as speak up for what is right and against injustices. So I agree with a lot there. And I think that it's a really unique opportunity for us as student leaders to kind of change how things are in the country.
Just like what you both said, I think it's really important now for us as student leaders to make change, because everything's going to change. Nothing's going to be the same anymore. So I think right now is most crucial to opening yourself up to growth, to learning, to making yourself open, having an open mind. And so I think this movement is just a big eye-opener to what the government has done. So I think this is really crucial for us, like I said.
Our next question is, has there been something you have learned recently that has changed how you perceive this issue? If so, please share.
Yes, I think a great example. So I sometimes think in analogies, and I try to put myself in the shoes of, in many cases, people who haven't had dialogue about, let's say, racial issues. And so for people within the Black community or people who are in minority communities, a lot of times there's discussions that happen, let's say, within a community about something either you're feeling or about, let's say, the group that is, let's say, in the majority. And so being a Black man, I'm okay and confident in talking about, let's say, both who I am and both how race interacts, let's say, with me. What I think has been different about this series of events between Ahmaud Arbery, the case in New York City, the case with George Floyd, is we're having discussions like this outside of the tables that we used to sit at in high school. So in many cases again, you go back to the high school analogy, it's one thing to have a conversation within an echo chamber of the group that you're with, meaning if you're with a Mormon, if you're white, if you're Black, if you're Latino or Asian, one thing that dialogue goes in there. But once you then start to talk to, let's say, other groups or other people who sit at different tables, conversations can go one of two ways. They can either, we can yell and scream at one another to be able to try to get our point across, or we can turn the volume down and try to be able to listen and talk and empathize with each other. And so for me, as I went through this process, what I try to do is to say, okay, it's one thing to we're still at the same place in 2020 in many cases that we were in, whether it's 1960, 1860, 1760, 1660. And so what this is, I said, rather than yelling or screaming, I said, let me calm, be patient, keep my mouth quiet, and formulate my thoughts. And then to be able to say, let me think through what it's like to be in a place of privilege. Now, I'm an African-American man, and so from a racial standpoint, I don't sit in a place of privilege as, from a descendant of people in this country, let's say, that has been oppressed. But I'm a man. And in our country, in many cases, I have a privilege, particularly serving in a business capacity, in that there's certain privileges that I have as a man that, let's say, sometimes women don't have. And so by recognizing my privilege as a man, it has given me a different perspective as to how I can teach or lead, in many cases, white people who have never had the conversation to really put themselves in the shoes of a place to really understand whether it's their white privilege or just privilege in general. And so I, as a leader who hire people, I employ people, I start businesses or engage, I'm now super mindful that if my own instincts are to hire men or to elevate men or to pay men higher than women, I need to check myself in order to be able to make sure that the workplace in which I operate or lead is much more equally balanced, right? So if I only interview a slate of all men, how do I know that I'm getting the best candidate if I'm not unlocking the potential of both genders in society? And so what I say that is that hopefully that as a Black man, me talking about my own privilege, that's in a different setting, it may help other people who haven't necessarily wrestled with their own privileges to make sure that they're not complicit. Because I think what's different about this conversation is to say it's no longer enough to say that George Floyd having a foot or a knee on his neck for 8.5 minutes and have his life taken away, and just recognizing that as an unfortunate instant is no longer enough. Is this time, or the change in this conversation, is to be able to say there's something more meaningful and deeper that we need to have a reckoning with us as Americans. And quite frankly, the difference in this situation is my white friends, my white male counterparts, they've called me up in a way that is different from what happened with Trayvon Martin. It's different from what happened with the many number of names, Bryanna Taylor, that have happened in the past. Something in this instance triggered that said, you know what, this is different, and we need to utilize this moment as an opportunity, in many cases, from white man to white man or within the white community, to be able to say, this is not the country in which we need, that I want to be a part of or lead of, that treats people and makes these things acceptable. And it's not just the one act of the knee on the neck. It is the coroner's report saying that it was natural causes. It's the the justice system not prosecuting, people not being held accountable. And so what I'm hoping is this moment is just like this, a teachable moment for us to have a dialogue, for us to all recognize the privilege that we have. And some for us, that privilege may be based on the fact that we are white, that it may be that we're male, but we are also privileged as Americans. And so it wasn't until I went and lived in Mexico, until I went and lived in the United Kingdom, that I realized of how privileged I am and we are as Americans. And by recognizing that, hopefully we can turn the volume down so we can talk to one another about real solutions to make sure that we have an equal playing field for all people to succeed.
I was actually listening to a podcast today, and it was called So What Is the Issue? I was just listening to it, and it said something that just really changed. I really just thought about it. And so they said that this system, the government, is not broken. The system is doing what it was made to do. The system was made by men to act dishonesty for personal gain. And so that was just like a shocking moment for me, because how many founding fathers owned slaves? For me, I was like, oh, I never like took the time to think of something like that. That's something that really shifted. That is correct. Like, the system is doing what it was made to do. Like, it's made to treat people with dishonesty, make white people superior to everyone else, basically. So that I learned that today, and I also learned that the life expectancy of a Black trans woman is 35 years old. 35 years old. And I did some further research, and for females, it's 75. So I was like, why is a Black trans woman dying 40 years earlier than she's expected to? Like, how is, like, it's just like Black Lives Matter, and that includes Black trans women, that includes everyone in that realm. So like, why is this happening? And so it's just like opening my eyes to those things, and I'm just like, it's just so overwhelming, and it's just like so.
No, Bryanna, I think part of growing up and part of the maturation process, and you as a leader are going to have to wrestle with a lot of different components, right? And so there's a lot of information that you're going to be able to take in, and everyone else. And so one of the things and it's interesting you to kind of bring up the founding fathers is, if you really go back and read the documents, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, whether it's Thomas Jefferson's writings, these are beautifully written documents by extremely complex men, and supported, by women and people of color throughout. And so I'm an eternal optimist. And so I think in many cases, as we look historically at both our nation's founding, we left with a spirit of saying, hey, look, all men are created equal, right? And leaving, the United Kingdom under oppression there, and then coming here, but then turn around and then, supporting the transatlantic slave movement. And so it is extremely complex, our nation's history and our nation's founding. And so there's two roads that you can take. There's one is you can say, hey, we are at our core are a nation that is striving to become a more perfect union. Or, in some cases, maybe sound like this podcast is to say, hey, look, it was founded in order to oppress, and it's kind of codified and it can't change. I tend to believe that we are a nation that is striving to become a more perfect union. And when we have been less perfect, it's when we have not allowed, whether it's immigrants to our country, whether it's allowed, we've been xenophobic, that we've been have people enslaved. But at our core, the reason why, and we increasingly as Americans and as citizens of the world, we're going to have a choice. Is unlike, what hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, we all can choose where it is that we want to live and where we want to become. And so I think whether it's this movement or this country, our better days are ahead of us. However, our best days can only be achieved if we recognize when we were at our worst. And if we cannot, as citizens of the same United States, correct each other, or at a minimum, talk to each other that says, our nation was not at our best when we enslaved people. Our nation was not at best when we didn't allow women the opportunity to vote. Our nation is better when we allowed children of DACA to be able to stay here and become a part of our country. We are at our best when the Supreme Court, even with conservative justice, saying that, hey, look, we cannot discriminate based upon people's sexual identity. We will be at our best when Black trans women have a same or greater life expectancy as the general public. And so the question is either going to be, we need to have as much energy paid towards pointing out our faults as a country as we have in the energy it's going to take to make us a more perfect union, right? And so it doesn't matter if you were if your parents immigrated as Italian immigrants when there's the big wave earlier in this last century, or came over after the Irish famine and came through. At some point, most people who came here at some point were discriminated against, right? The unfortunate part is that over time, the Irish, after they were discriminated against, they became, let's say, white. And in many cases, what we need to define is to have people remember back to when your family first came here and when you were the other, and when you were subjugated against or you were discriminated against. Tap back into that, because this whole notion of whiteness is a 21st century phenomenon that was meant to divide people, to make one group of people better than the others. But when we disintegrate the whiteness, ultimately we're either Irish or Italian or all these different kind of components. And as we think about people of color, we're descendants of people, and tapping back into that and getting that notion, I think, will make people more optimistic as to what we can be. Because if we do say, hey, the system is rigged, it's against us, we can't be any better, we then are going to be a nation that is divided, and we are going to go back to those tables in the high school room and only stick to our table. And we aren't going to be able to tap in to the fullness of what is the American spirit. And I fully believe in the American spirit. And with it, if you fully believe in America, you can't fully agree with supremacy. If you fully agree with America, you have to believe that we are better together than we are, let's say, separate. And so you're at a fine point. Over the next 4 years, what's going to matter for you, Bryanna, is the books you read, the people you meet, the conversations that you challenge yourself with, not just at your same table, but at others. Because if we can't win you, Bryanna, if we can't win and make sure that you continue to be optimistic and think the fullness of our country, we're lost. Because the country's going to look more like you than it is whether it's me or whether the kind of the broader complexion. And so I challenge, and I hope that you and Aiden and others continue to stay optimistic, continue to stay positive, and figure out how do we unlock the potential of the Black trans woman, of all the different tables in the cafeteria.
Awesome. So let's go to our next question. How can you educate your family or individuals who do not understand or support the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, and look, I think we have to be realistic in the sense that we are such a polarized nation that if you think of let's call it the hashtag Black Lives Matter, there are some people who will never, let's say, agree, never choose to open themselves, let's say, up. And so in so many cases of this it's really, not for any one of us to push, let's say, a movement, a brand upon anyone. But I think what's important is to ask the right questions to be able to open people's minds to having a conversation, a dialogue. Because I think, as we think about what's going on in our everyday lives, it is very hard to argue beliefs, right? We can present, let's say, facts, we can present history, but then there's an interpretation, and then there's people's life and lived experiences. My lived experience is a middle-class African-American man who's grown up in Las Vegas and has an amazing level of opportunity. But that's extremely different from my dad, who grew up in rural Alabama, highly segregated notion, who didn't go to integrated schools and has been subject to discrimination for most of his, adult life until things started to change later in life. So his experience is different from mine, right? And it's going to be different from white people who grew up in the South or grew up in the suburbs or grew up, internationally. And so I think we have to not be so worried about how are we going to make people accept our point of view, but how can we engage in a dialogue so that at a minimum people listen. And so as part of this is hopefully through these conversations and even through today is that hopefully it's a way that will illuminate a conversation to hear someone else's perspective. And so, whether it's through this or through the work that you all continue to do, I would encourage us as leaders to ask more questions, to listen more than it is to promulgate, let's say, our ideas, because I'm a firm believer that no political party, no wing of this dialogue has a monopoly on good ideas. But everyone has a perspective and everyone is valued and is worth listening to. We all may not agree, but at least if we can have a civil discussion to be able to illuminate, over time, the median or the middle of America, I think will come around to saying America is a place that we want to make sure that we unlock potential, not lock potential, that we want to move forward, not backwards. And I think with the unfortunate circumstances of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, it has propagated this discussion into everyday life, that we are moving this conversation forward from that perspective.
I agree when you said that. I think the country right now is very polarized. We're very, people are very set in one belief or the other. There's two distinct sides, I think, to a lot of issues in our country, not just the Black Lives Matter movement, but everything. And it can be really frustrating to talk to someone and not have them listen. So I think that, and maybe they're listening, they just don't care. They don't, respect your opinion, and they will never agree with you. And it's frustrating, and it's really tiring sometimes, because I know I've had conversations like that with even people, in my extended family or such. And it's annoying, but I think that it's something that's important, is to talk to people, and you have to be intentional with what you say. You can't just be arguing with people just to argue with them. You want to teach them something or have them recognize your point of view. A lot of times people will not agree with you, and it's annoying, but I mean, you have to try and try to educate people.
You have to try, and you also have to recognize is that in many cases, people don't change their mind in an instant. There's very few things in life that is, you come into some indication of any introduction of element and then do a complete 180. People are people, and we're humans. And so in many cases, things happen gradually. And so I know I didn't learn many things on my first encounter with information. And people sometimes receive information, then react. But it's like the 7 stages of grief. Like, you have to go through each component to really come out and be strengthened on the other side. And so I think is that we'll never know where people are along that spectrum. And so I'm a big believer. It takes 7 pats on the back for every one kick in the butt when you're trying to give someone, let's say, feedback. And so in this case is in many ways is be empathetic, right? I've never coached, developed, and I never appreciated, let's say, being yelled at. So if we find yourself yelling, it's like your point's not going to get across. In many cases, people are going to put up a moat in just a reaction to the energy that you're bringing across. And so conversations like this and turning the volume down on the energy, or turning the volume down on the polarization, can help people meet in the middle and find some commonality.
I had a question. So like in a situation, like you're at school, right? And so you hear someone who is non-Black, like this is just a situation, say the N-word.
Mm-hmm.
Like, since we're in school, how would we like approach the situation? Because I at school all the time, that's something that you hear. So I'm just like, how would we approach the situation towards them and help make that?
It's great. I mean, it's great. And I think particularly as you all go back to school and we start to think about these things. And it's interesting because in many cases, within the Black community, we let's say have been the recipient of that word and use that word in many cases too casually amongst ourselves. And particularly as I think it's going to be ever increasingly important for educators, for leaders to be able to stamp that out so that we're then able to enforce universally, let's say, rules. So now let's say if we use just the opposite, which is becoming, less prominent, where people are making, let's say, explicit, let's say whether it's racist or using, the N-word in that manner. What we have an obligation as leaders, as a student leader, is that we have the ability to not only speak up if you see something, say something, but you also, and this is the unique role that, student government leaders have, is people are respected and people look up to you all. And what I've always found is that if you're able to catch people one-on-one and be able to say, hey, look, I either overheard this or I caught wind, I wanted to come and approach you, and just to kind of give you a perspective of how that came across, whether it's in the one-on-one setting, in a group setting, or whatever else, so that you're able to go directly to that person to be able to kind of engage. Sometimes you're not able to, because if this person is too out of the ordinary, whatever that may be. But if, as a student body president, I would do that, all the time, where you saw one person bullying another one or some doing another one. Now, I had the self-confidence, the ability, and the football player and a lot of teammates as well to be able to say, hey, cut it out, stop it, right? And if you have that relationship with your student body, because you've acknowledged that person in the past, because you said hello, because you've invited them and you welcomed them, that creates an internal currency that you have, that you're recognized as a leader, where you can reinforce positive behavior, but also correct negative behavior. But then in addition to that, we've become so polarized as a country and as a high school and as a student, that you should never feel like that you can't go to an adult or share that with someone of leadership to help for them to be able to reinforce. But sometimes things can be longer lasting when you all as young people check and correct each other, so that it becomes a part of the culture that says, hey, look, we just don't do that here, right? And in some cases, what I think we're going to find is there's going to be more conversations with non-Black people to Black people in certain settings within a school setting, to be able to say, hey, look, we can't use that language because it's going to help empower a system and a culture within the student body to say, because look, if a white person did, let's say in the same school setting, like I would have to go and check and talk to them. And so I think through this, there's going to be an obligation not only within the Black community, but then within other communities, to really making sure that we are that we're enforcing the rules equally, as well as creating a culture in which we all can grow and thrive.
All right, so our last question is, in what ways should you go about raising awareness for the Black Lives Matter movement?
Great. And so I think, and I'll share this for the group, I think and this is where and why language, like at my heart, I'm still a student body president running for re-election. And so in some ways, some people will turn off the minute you says raising awareness for Black Lives Matter movement. Like I believe in Black Lives Matter and I do that. But what I would say is that at the core of it, Black Lives Matter is a reaction to white supremacy, right? And so this is one where someone may never ascribe to the movement of Black Lives Matter, because there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of other things that people may say. The Black Lives Matter movement is in support of, whether it's protest, some people may then say it's a support of the riots, some people it's support of XYZ. What I would say is to be able to say is more asking the question is do you believe that do you believe that white people are superior to Black people? No. Do you believe that there are things that we could do as a country to make us more equal? Hopefully most people say yes. And so I think to this end is by asking open-ended questions, as opposed to making someone who may never ascribe to just the brand because of everything is so polarized, is more so is, what do you think we can do to help make our country better? What do you think we can do, because our country at one point enslaved people, because at one point in our country had segregation, because we treated gay people different than straight people. We did this versus that. And so by asking the question, hopefully that spurs thought and intellect, as opposed to someone consuming a brand that they just, for whatever reason, may never choose to. And so my hope through this is not so much that everyone says, hey, I agree with everything that the Black Lives Matter, let's say, does, because, I follow it somewhat, but, ultimately my goal is to help make the union more perfect. And in order to do that, it may not necessarily making people ascribe to my belief, but I do think having people have independent thought and really kind of educating themselves will help us to get us there. And so I pose the question as to, what are you willing to sacrifice, or what are willing to do in order to make us a more perfect union? And so through that, hopefully someone may have a light bulb and say, you know what, I am privileged. I don't have to face the things that people of color or people who don't look like me or people who are in a minority group have to face. And here's the things that I'm willing to do. I'm willing to make sure that if I'm a white male, that if I'm a setting where people are talking about people of a different race in a negative way, I'm willing to speak up and say something. If I'm a male and I'm in a position to have a hiring position, I'm going to make sure that I interview the most diverse set of candidates. If I am the student body president, if I'm the student council leader and I'm putting together a group, I'm going to go out of my way to go find someone who's at a different table, who's at a different walk of life, who is a leader and who should be involved in this program. And I'm going to commit myself to proactively doing something differently and not just going along with the status quo. And so this goes back to what John F. Kennedy said, like, what am I, not what is your country willing to do for you, but what am I willing to do for my country? This is a time for patriots to stand up and say, what am I able to do? And so I have to have one flag is tomorrow, we as a state need to start to wear face coverings. And so the Governor Sisolak, says that we can help defeat COVID by making sure that we cover our face. This should no longer be a partisan issue. And I challenge you all as NASC leaders, if I get you these masks, I want to see you guys wearing them, promoting them, getting out there and doing everything you can to make us a safer state. And I appreciate your time, Aiden. Thank you, Bryanna.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, guys.